A special panel is being convened by the U.S. Department of Transportation to review how the FAA certifies planes.
This is just the latest in what promises to be a very busy week in the grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX fleet following two deadly crashes. King 5's aviation specialist Glenn Farley has been tracking this since the beginning and joins us with the new info.
A lot to talk about and a lot to see. Often called blue ribbon committees or commissions, the Transportation Department, which oversees the Federal Aviation Administration, wants an independent review panel to review how the government oversees certification of new aircraft, including the Boeing MAX. The global fleet of grounded 737 MAX aircraft may be off limits to passengers, but over Washington state there are plenty in the air. Sky King and Flight Tracking Services this afternoon finding no fewer than 4 performing test flights ranging as far west as the Washington coast, east to Moses Lake, and south to Portland. It would appear the company intends to maintain production as it works to fix the problems in the MAX. Each new jet goes through a series of standardized test flights for the airlines, but actual deliveries to those airlines won't resume until the FAA signs off, and other countries may take longer. As part of the struggle to get back on track, the company says it began briefing pilots and technical leaders from the airlines on its fixes. We're learning the Saturday session focused on the 737 MAX engineering simulator near Boeing Field. This coming Wednesday, the company stated it plans to bring in 200 pilots, technical leads, and regulators for an informational session at the 737 factory in Renton. Those fixes include what's expected to become standard on all MAXs, an indicator which would tell pilots their angle of attack sensors on the nose don't match up. The sensors have always been there, but on the MAX they're connected to a system called MCAS, which is designed to keep the airplane from pitching up and going into a dangerous stall. But the system relies on just one of the sensors, and if it gives off bad data, it could cause the plane to point nose down, which is believed to have been the case in both the Indonesian and Ethiopian crashes. But the accidents, the global grounding, and now even a criminal review of the certification process which pronounced the MAX as airworthy, has upended a decades-old process where some Boeing engineers and employees are delegated by the FAA to oversee much of the certification, begging the question, is the company and the regulator too close? In its announcement, Federal Department of Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao says that Blue Ribbon panel will let outside experts help determine if improvements can be made to the FAA aircraft certification process. But while these two crashes, the sensors, the MCAS system, and the job of certifying it all in focus, in a statement, John Hamilton, Boeing's chief engineer, says the airplane's primary flight display showing pitch, altitude, attitude, headings, and vertical speed and other things are what really is needed to perform a safe flight. Classifying that angle of attack indicator is really supplemental information that may help explain inconsistencies in information, at least as it relates to the AOA received between the pilot and the co-pilot, or the pilot and the first officer.
All right. Glenn, thank you.